Good morning and welcome to today's lecture. This topic that we'll cover today and maybe in our next class next week is on what is called identity management. Of course, what we are doing now is that we are changing gear from the topics that so far were covered, more about the theory of blockchain. Here, what we'll do is that we'll see essentially one of the fundamental requirements of any sort of online transactions, which is management of identity, and how we can use the blockchains for ensuring the same. Before we talk about digital identities, okay, which of course is required for carrying out any form of online transactions, first we need to know what is identity. We of course know what it means, okay? And people are known by their identities, and even in real life we have our identities. So can someone define what is meant by identity, or how you prove your identity in real life, in the physical world? Anyone? What do you mean by identity?
There's some unique data that identifies us or that is unique to us.
Okay, very good. So uniqueness is important, and identifies means you can be distinguished from another similar entity. Very good. And how do you prove your identity?
Some at places name, date of birth, uh, where we study,
Okay,
and like
that
if in
what?
physical world by our face, that is the identity.
Yeah, but on your face your name is not written, right? So
Yes,
uh, so then how is that handled? So your
It
face,
should
I
be
mean,
certified by a third party whom we all trust.
okay, in the physical world, who could that be?
Maybe governments, government agencies.
Government. Government agencies. So how will a government agency do that? So can you give an example of your how you can prove your identity somewhere in real life? In
Aadhaar.
Aadhaar cards are unique.
Okay, okay. So always remember that we should not always keep talking about the government is always controlling everything about us. That we need to keep in mind. Okay. So it is a trusted party is fine, but that need not necessarily be the government all the time. It could be, as you said, that it is one example is of course the Aadhaar card, but it could be my school's principal also who has issued an identity card to me, right? There is nothing uh, more special about the other card as compared to my school principal, and my school might be a private school, and the identity card that I get as a student of that school. So that also proves my identity, as long as it is about establishing who I am to some other um, organization. So both could be equal, as long as it only shows that this is me. Okay. Now, what else is there? As some of you mentioned, that in the so let us call that as an ID card. Okay, whether it is an Aadhaar card or a PAN card or school identity card or IIT Kharagpur issued ID card. So it is like an identity card. Okay, so of course that name itself includes the term identity, and this ID card. Okay, so this is something that helps in establishing my identity when someone is asking for it. Okay, and it is a collection of attributes. So it would have my name, maybe my photo, some my age, I mean date of birth, and it could be even address and more details. So depends on, like for example, my identity card in Kharagpur tells me that when I had joined and till which date it is valid. Similarly, if you, those of you who have your IT Kharagpur ID card, you will see that it is mentioned that when it was issued, and sometimes also till which date it is valid. Maybe it also gives some history, like address, for example, your name of your hall, or it could even have your uh, room number and all that stuff. Okay, and of course, when things change in real life, we may also have to update the ID card. Okay. So one point about this identity in the physical world, as you said, so there is a physical piece of uh, document which we call as, say, the ID card, which is important, where all these types of information are noted, like my details. Okay. What else is there with this ID card? So first of all, as you said correctly, that it is issued by someone, and someone said trusted third party and so on. So it has been issued by the institute or the school or the government and so on. Okay. So that is another important component of any form of identification, that who has vouched for that identity. And what is the third important aspect of identity? So one is the owner or the subject, to whom this identity belongs. The second is that you mentioned that this is the issuer of that identity. And what is the third thing?
Details which it contains, sir.
Sorry?
The details which the
Yeah,
identity
details.
has.
Yeah, absolutely right. So very good. So one is about who it refers to, the subject, the who has issued it, what it contains, the details about the subject, and then what else is related to this identity or ID card. Okay, let me, I think the question may not be clear based on what I asked. So let me tell you that what is the use of this ID card? You have been given, issued this ID card by, say, IIT Kharagpur, then you keep it with you all the time, or is there any use of this ID card?
Authentication's purpose, sir.
Authentication means
Whenever
what?
to authenticate that the person with who has this identity card is the one, and he is authorized for accessing a particular thing for which that card is meant for.
But don't let us not talk in this abstract sense. Okay, in real life, what do you do with your ID card? Say, what do you do with your Aadhaar card?
So suppose vaccination for COVID, we can
Right.
consider.
Yeah, yeah. So vaccination center, you place your Aadhaar card, right? You present your Aadhaar card. So what do they do?
So they verify the information if it is correct. Like they ask my phone number, then they see the face if it matches, and so the phone number is the only verification that they carry out.
Okay, okay, okay. That is good. And of course, maybe they try to match your face with the photo on the other card, but I don't know whether anybody's face matches with the photo on the other card so easily. But so if there is no vaccination, no corona and all, then what would have been the use of your other card? So far, where have you used it most commonly? Or a PAN card?
Voting.
So, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Voting.
Voting, yeah, voting may be your voter ID card, but other than that, what is the most common
Purchasing SIM cards, sir. Telephone SIM, mobile SIMs.
so none of you have any bank account, right? Or in banks they do not ask for any ID. So that is possibly the most common one, like we do, that you go to the bank and present it. But of course, all of these examples you said are very correct for SIM card and all. And now you see that why we are asking these questions is that through the answers you have actually come up with the different components that are associated with identity. Okay. So very good. So all these are important. We go for voting, we go for opening accounts, we go for buying SIM cards, we go for vaccination, and so on. So you see that we have this, because the term that you use, that there is this trusted third party, quote unquote third party. Okay. So then who are the first party and the second party? Okay. So the first party is possibly the subject to whom the identity belongs. The second party is actually this term that you just now mentioned, that verifying, etc. So that is important. So there is this notion of a verifier of the identity. Okay. And then it is basically the transaction that is going to happen between the okay, and then that transaction that is happening, that is now uh, based on, or this, as you someone you said, that you are authenticating whether this indeed is the correct person that this person is claiming to be. Okay, so that is being set up through that identity card, which is the identity of the user, but that has been issued by some sort of an issuer. Okay, so these are these three components. Okay, so that is very important. And of course, the issuer had issued it once, but now I am using it, or the subject is using it again and again for transactions with various types of such verifiers. Okay, so that is what we need to keep in mind. And of course, there are more details, as you said, besides my photo and all. We can have a lot of these types of information associated with my identity. And you can take a look at this link as is shown here on this slide, as to what is meant by the future of identity management. And actually, the goal of this set of slides, this lecture, essentially is to see how we can do identity management in the digital world, and how blockchains can be used to facilitate that. Okay, so that is the overall goal that we have. That is towards what we are going to go to. But initially, we first understand what is meant by identity in the physical world, and then moving on, we talk about centralized digital identity. Okay, and remember that whatever we talked about physical identity just now, we will be using those terms, and also we'll be using the concepts out there when we talk about various aspects of digital identity. Okay. Now, let us consider digital identity. Okay, so let us. Do you have any example of a digital identity? Anywhere where you might your digital identity has been used? Yeah, go ahead.
Username and password.
No, that is not actually going to identify you as such, right? I mean, it is true. So let us consider that it is that you are authenticating yourself with your user ID and password, but that is important. But you see that you can set up any user ID and any password. Okay, so one user ID and password that you are using, that is not your unique identification. But in some cases, where if you are interacting with a particular application, you have yourself set a user ID and you have set a password. You could have as well have set up another user ID and another password associated with it. Okay, but so that is not really similar to the notion of digital identity. Okay, anything else where you might have
Maybe account
used it?
number, sir.
Account number. Okay, now consider these three things: that who issues it, okay, to whom it has been issued, and who verifies it. In that context, okay, so if you consider all these, yeah, go ahead, go ahead. Yeah, so so we need to consider these three together. Okay, now let me give you some examples. Okay, one, so those of you who have possibly like this, including the SIM card example that you said. Okay, and those of you who have recently got your passport issued, so if you see that if you try to get your SIM card, what we do is that when you do this online verification, so there you claim that you are this person, you may carry your Aadhaar card, or even the Aadhaar card number is sufficient. And there they have this small device where you have to put your finger, and based on that, with that Aadhaar card, what they do, they are going to go and hit the Aadhaar database. Okay, and same thing they do for passport also, where they will check that with this Aadhaar number, whoever is the person, what is the fingerprint of that person, and whether that is matching with this person who has now come for issuing of a SIM card or issuing of a passport. Okay, so all of you have possibly done it, unless you have done this submission of your Aadhaar cards as hard copies, but you possibly have done it, or even for your Paytm verification and all, you possibly have done these things. Okay, so you see that there is this centralized place which is maintaining the digital identity. So somewhere in that UIDI this database, they have your other information along with fingerprints and your other against your other number and so on. Okay. Now, if you look at this picture here, so we are the like the users or the subjects on the left, and there is this central place which is holding the digital identity, and then on the right hand side we have the verifier. Okay, so what can happen is that first of all, we as subjects, we have no clue what is stored in the other database about us. Okay, in the sense that how does my fingerprint look like, what information about the fingerprint is kept there. Okay, what about the iris data that is kept there. So we have hardly any visibility over the identity attributes that we have. Okay, now what can happen is that while this verifier is asking for verification, say, of my other information like the fingerprint and all, so an attacker could be there in between, and then attacker could present the details to the verifier. Okay, so if we do not have full control on what is maintained in that particular centralized repository as is shown here, okay, then any attacker in between could intercept and present those identity as his or her own. Okay, now unless there is a proper authentication which shows that these are indeed, first of all, my details, my identity information. Secondly, also it is important that the the verifier is also certain that he is getting it from the correct centralized digital repository. Okay, that, and it is not coming from an attacker. So that is the second point that is important. Also, one needs to keep in mind that, say for example, my other details are there with in a central place. Okay, then is it possible that anyone can ask for verifying me without even my permission? So we have to think about that aspect also. Okay, so that when the verification is being done, who is doing the verification and whether that person is authorized to do the verification at all or not. So these are some of the important concepts, and if someone can break into this centralized repository, then they can actually change, for example, my fingerprint information by that attacker's fingerprint information, and once that is done, everything is completely gone because it is all in a centralized location. And it is not only for this example of Aadhaar card and all. So you might have heard about these instances that so many people's other information was stolen by attackers, or so many people's credit card information was stolen by the attackers, and so on. So all these are happening because these are all being stored in a centralized place. Okay, and once it is stolen, you don't know how it is being used. Okay, so we have to keep in mind that when we talk about digital identity, unlike the physical identity, then once an attacker has access to that, this identity can be used in many different forms, including for carrying out different types of malicious operations. Okay. Moving on, if you have heard of this term, how many of you have heard of this term single sign-on? Anyone has any idea what is single sign-on and an example? Anyone? No one has heard the term single sign-on?
Is it related to the OAuth services we use in the application?
What
Uh,
services?
OAuth services, like in the websites we go and they don't ask for the like separate user separate registration. They just
Mhm.
say that sign in using something like Google ID or
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that is what it really is. So the single sign-on means that single identity is being used for various purposes. Okay, so we do not need to maintain multiple identity documents. Okay, And this has been widely used in the software industry, one password to access multiple services. And you see that if you log into Google, say for your Gmail, then you can use the drive without doing anything, and or again authenticating yourself, or basically in the context of identity without presenting your identity information once again. And similarly, of course, these are all within the same service provider, but as you said correctly, that it can be extended, and it is also extended to others, like you could say sign in with your Facebook and do certain things. Okay, so these are all examples of single sign-on. Now in this case, what is happening is that this identity, okay, is being provided by a single identity provider. So this identity provider is, in short, we call it as IDP, and we'll be using this term quite a few times later on. And that is the service provider which is maintaining the identity. Okay, and the consumers, okay, the services, they are talking to the IDP to authenticate the identity holder. Okay, now what it means? It means that I have my identity with, say, Google. Okay, so IDP is Google, and now I want to access, say, my Make My Trip account, and if they allow me to use my Google account for presenting my identity, then they will be talking to Google, and of course that if I have given them the permission, so they will be using my Google identity to authenticate me, and then I can carry out the transaction. Okay, now what is important is that during this authentication process, the identity is not exposed to the service, so they will only know that this is an authenticated user, okay, whose identity has been verified. But who that person is, like, by that I mean that who are the what are the other details, including my even user ID, password. I mean, of course, password they will not know. Even my user ID is not in that sense checked. That is that, of course, it has to be ensured that it is matching with me when I am trying to go into Make My Trip. Okay, but all other details about this particular identity, so these are not exposed to Make My Trip. So they only know that whoever is trying to access this Make My Trip account has been authenticated by presenting appropriate identity to the identity provider, which has validated it, and now it is being used by multiple such services, as is shown in this figure. And also you can have some more details about this process of single sign-on in this site, and you can, and some of these diagrams that we show on the slides are taken from this particular page. So more details about what a single sign-on concept means you can get from this site. So this is something that is important. Okay, but also we have to understand that like the centralized digital identity, the problems that we mentioned, okay, this single sign-on does not really overcome that problem. It is still there with one IDP, and if that is somehow compromised, then we cannot do much about it, and an attacker could be presenting my identity to multiple services and get the job done. Okay. So, but this is an important concept that people thought of when they talked about digital identity. Okay. Next is that our goal would be to decentralize this notion of uh, digital identity verification and maintenance of digital identity. So that is the overall goal that we have in this lecture. For that, we have understood that what are the problems if there is a centralized IDP for maintaining all this identity related information. And let us see that as some of you mentioned that this my user ID, password, these are my identity. Okay. Now, one point that we have to really appreciate is that what we say as our digital identity, okay, and what we have physically as part of our identity information, they are separate, and there is also a disconnect between these two, in the sense that, say, you create a user ID and password in Google, okay, where I say this is my name, this is my last name, this is my date of birth, and so on, and this, then I create a user ID, and then I set a password. Okay, but all these, what happens is that these are all digital identities. They have actually no link with me as a physical person. I could have just entered anything that I wanted, including the name, including the date of birth, and so on. They do not really tie up with this my physical identity. Okay, so if you see that, if you consider your Aadhaar card, that is a physical identity, but that does not have any digital identity associated with it. Likewise, if you consider your uh, say account in Google, that is a digital identity, but that has no physical identity associated with it. Okay, are you able to follow what I'm saying? So this physical identity and digital identity, there is a disconnect between these two. Okay, so does anyone know how these two are connected in certain businesses? And you, all of you, have done the same. So the question is that this digital identity that we talk about, which is about user ID, password, and other stuff like date of birth, etc., that we entered and create a digital identity like in Google or some other businesses. I am not mentioning that because that will give you the hint. So I would like you to think about it. And the physical identities like your Aadhaar card or PAN card or so on. So what is the process by which these two are tagged together? Anyone has any idea?
KY.
Yeah, absolutely correct. So that is the right answer. So if we consider your bank, so there you have that digital identity. Means if you consider your online banking, you have all the details about like your user ID, password, you have your account number associated with, and so on. But then that can operate on its own, even if you do not associate that with your physical identity. And remember, that is also another good example of single sign-on, because for many banks, through their internet banking, through their online banking account, you can actually say go to some of the income tax sites, because your PAN card is there, so it links with that, and it can take you to a site where you can get some of the income tax documents. We call it as 26As forms, etc., downloaded without authenticating yourself once again to that site. You could separately authenticate there, or you could use your internet banking, online banking account, and that could act as a single sign-on. Okay. So this is what I first thought of telling you, so that you have some more example of digital identity helping in single sign-on. Now, coming back to this point about KYC, now this KYC is actually what the bank is doing. It is associating um, your digital identity with the physical identity. Okay, and once you have that association, then that account user ID that you have, that now not only links you to all your digital information, but also links it back to your physical properties. And one more example is shown here, like mobile companies, they also do this KYC verification and so on. And different countries can have different ways of doing it, or different businesses can have different ways of doing it. But in this example, what we see here is that the user has the identity database with the IDP, and this could be validated through the KYC validation process of any mobile company, or some other such institute. And then, if you are using single sign-on, as the title shows in this slide, that you could authenticate yourself first to the identity database maintained with the IDP, and then you could present that to a bank or a post office, or public sector other services, or even private services, and so on. So depends on who are all subscribing to this single sign-on process, and they are going to, of course, trust this IDP. But even then, as you can see, that still this IDP being a centralized repository of all identity information, the same vulnerabilities that we talked about here, they still remain. Okay. Although now we have some linking of the digital identity with the physical identity, and also we have the process of single sign-on. Okay. So now the goal is that we need to decentralize this digital identity maintenance and identity verification process. Okay. So the goal is that there will not be any centralized trusted identity provider or registry. Okay. And there will be a digital representation of physical identity. And there are, of course, there are two major problems that are to be overcome if we want to have this decentralized digital identity. One is that verifying the identity issuer, and the second is verifying the identity holder. So here again, that example that is shown is that maybe the issuer is a government or maybe my school or something, and then that digital identity was issued to the holder. And when a verifier challenges the holder that, oh, you have to present your digital identity to get certain service, so the holder will present this identity that was issued by the government to the verifier, and the verifier, if it is matching in some sense, quote unquote matches, then the verifier will be ready to provide me the service. Okay, but what can still happen is that now there could be an attacker which could first of all mm, get hold of this digital identity and then place it to the verifier. Now, if you look at the example of this identity, this IDP who is keeping the identity database, okay, then if an attacker gets hold of this digital identity of a particular original holder and then replace that to the verifier, then the verifier will not have any way of knowing whether it is the real holder or it is the attacker, because when it is digital identity, then the attacker can catch hold of this certificate that was issued by the issuer to the holder. So I am calling that a certificate just to show that that is basically the digital identity information. And then if it places, the verifier will see that this is a valid piece of information, and this may be accepted. Okay. So there are two issues. One is that here, that whether the identity holder is the correct one or not, the verifier may not be able to figure out. Secondly is that even if this is placed, how would the verifier know that it was indeed issued by the government? Okay. So let me give you this example, just an analogy with respect to physical identification process. So suppose I have a PAN card, okay, and then someone asks me for my physical identity, and I place the PAN card, okay. So how will it know? How will the verifier know that this is indeed my PAN card? Okay. So you see that as someone who said that the verifier could try to match this photo that is there with my face, and if the verifier is satisfied, then it will be sure that it is very able to verify the identity holder. That is the second point. Okay, but you see that even that process all depends on the verifier's ability to match the two, right? My face and the face that is there showing on the PAN card. And in fact, my PAN card was issued, if you would believe, that it was issued in the year 93 or so, and I am still using the same PAN card. Okay, so that looks completely different from the PAN card you get these days. That is just a laminated piece of paper, and I am not sure if I look the same as I used to look those 30 years, almost 30 years. Okay, so you see that now verifying the holder, that is not always easy, and when it comes to digital identity, then it is even the face is not there, and I am not anyway there to show my face, right? So it is very difficult. Okay, and a challenge that we have to overcome. The other part is that now even if say I place the PAN card, okay, which shows my photo, everything is fine, but how would the verifier know that it was indeed issued by the income tax department? So how do you think that the verifier would come to know, or the verifier may not be able to know? What would be your comment? Anybody? So I could just present a PAN card to a verifier, to the bank, for example. How would the bank indeed know that it is a genuine PAN card? The face matches with mine, so it knows that it is my PAN card. But whether it has been issued by the appropriate authority or not, how would it know? Any idea? Anyone?
The number, PAN card number.
The PAN card number, I could print any PAN card number, so they are not going to know, right? That whether they are not going to check it against the income tax department's database, right?
Stamp public signatures.
Okay, so there might be, so what you said is that there might be some kind of a hologram or some kind of signature, but you can check whether you really have a signature, and just think that the bank uh, official, okay, to whom you have presented your PAN card, how would he be able to really verify that part? So the important point is that it is really a challenge to verify the identity issuer, who issued the identity. Even for this physical one, you see that it is not very easy. And we have to also consider that the same problem does exist for digital identity, and we have to have ways of ensuring that the verifier can verify the identity issuer. So, of course, the problems that we have in physical world, some of them are more challenging in the digital world, and some of them might be having some solutions in the digital world, but may not be so convenient solutions in the physical world. But at this stage, what we have been able to see here is, of course, that we have this issuer, the holder, and the verifier of the digital identity, and there could be some types of attacks as is shown here, and it is to be ensured that the verifier can verify the identity issuer and also can verify the identity holder whenever we are trying to talk about decentralizing digital identity also. And especially more so that if we decentralize it, means instead of one location from where everybody can verify, so then this verifying the identity issuer may not be that challenging. But when it is decentralized and the identity might be kept in different places, okay, not in a centralized location, it has to be ensured that the identity issuer is also verified. The next concept is, I just mentioned that in the passing once, sometime back early in the slides, is the notion of self-sovereign identity, or what is called privacy control. Now you look at this example again, that which is there in this in the brownish text here, is that suppose I have my PAN card, okay, so I possess this identity card, so and that has got one physical, because it's a physical identity, I have only one single copy. And then suppose it is with me, so nobody gets an opportunity to take a look at it and see what are the other pieces of information associated with it. And it is me who can decide where to present it, right? I can present it to the bank, like you have seen for the vaccine, that you might have this option of either giving your PAN card or your Aadhaar card or your passport and so on. So you see that you can decide which of your identities you would like to present in a particular situation. Okay, so it is you who decides who to whom you would be able to would like to present your ID. Okay, now the same in the digital world is what is called self-sovereign identity. Means I would like to decide where to present my identity. So that is my controlling the privacy. Okay, so we should have full control and ownership of the identity information, and can control the usage of their own identity profile for business and social interactions. Okay, so what it means, you see, let me give you one more example now in the digital world. Okay, suppose IIT Kharagpur maintains your transcript and your certificate, okay, information, and where there are some details. So that works like your identity. Okay, now suppose you are applying to a company for job, or you are applying to a university for higher studies. Okay, and then they say that we will not accept your copies of your certificates, but your university ID Kharagpur provides that service where it can share your this type of digital identity. So those are like your, one is your certificate, degree certificate, the other is your transcript. Okay. Now you see that first of all, you should be able to control where IIT Kharagpur can present your certificate, or where IIT Kharagpur can present your transcript. Okay, it should not be a case that a company asks and then your yeah, the institute IIT Kharagpur simply presents it without your consent. So if that is done, then it is violating this notion of self-sovereign identity principle. Okay. So I would authorize IIT Kharagpur to actually present this digital identity to different places. That is for business and social interactions, as we mentioned here. And also there I should be able to decide or determine which part of that identity, not the entire information has to be presented. So it could be a part of it, or it could be none at all. I could say, no, you cannot present it. Okay. So if some company is asking, you do not present it. Okay. And also I could say that, oh, if it is with the university who only need to know whether I completed the degree, I should be able to only present that part about my degree completion information, that part of my identity that IIT Kharagpur is maintaining to the university. But if they are not looking at my grades, then IIT Kharagpur should not be presenting all the information, including my grades in all subjects, to the university. Okay. So you see that the user should be able to control what amount of information about the identity can be divulged to the verifier, and it is being controlled actually by the issuer. Okay. So if it is given to me and then I can present, is always my choice. But if it is with the issuer and then the requests are coming directly from the verifiers to the issuer, it should be somehow mediated by me as to what amount of information in that digital identity that could be released. But of course, the last point, as you can see, is that this also has a flip side, that then the user, and not everybody would be so savvy as to decide where to present what kind of information about the identity and so on. It could put certain burden on the individual user also. So which is something that one needs to keep in mind. Now, with all that, next what we will try to do is that we'll try to see that what attempts have been made for coming up with this notion of decentralized identifiers, or DIDs, or DIDs for short. Okay. So this notion of decentralized identifiers, they provide verifiable. So it should be verified that now it is about whom and who is the issuer and so on. And it should be decentralized. It's not located in one central place, and it would be a digital identity. Okay. And it should be designed in such a way that it is decoupled from centralized registries or identity providers, as we have seen here, that this is this identity provider. There is a centralized registry, as we have seen that in one location we have this information. So it should be decoupled from that. And certificate authorities means nobody will directly certify, oh, this is the correct one, or this certificate is correct, that certificate is correct. So it should not be like this. And the holder of the DID can prove its ownership on the DID without the help of any other party. So it is important that if this identifier, this digital identifier which is decentralized, this DID is of me, then I should be able to prove to anyone without the help of any other party that this is indeed mine. Like this example that we are showing, that this attacker is presenting this ID of the holder to the verifier. Okay, that we should be able to prevent. Okay, so that is very important, and you can or it is strongly recommended that you go through this document, may not be in detail, but to get an idea as to what this is all about. And this is a W3C effort to come up with standardization of this notion of decentralized identifiers. So, so it is their proposed recommendation. So you can take a look at that. Okay. So the overall architecture for DID is like this, that for every DID, there should be some unique way of identifying it. Okay, so a DID actually refers to a DID subject. The subject is what we have seen before, that who basically this particular decentralized identifier, digital identifier that it pertains to. Okay, so that is the subject. So, for example, if I have some such decentralized identifier did, then this did a particular one particular did will be actually referring to me as a subject. So it could be human, it could be any object or whatever. And then there is this important concept of DID controller. So this controller is the one who decides or who controls or determines the content of what is called a DID document. So this DID document actually contains all this identification information about the DID subject. Okay. Now, we show logically that the DID controller is a different entity from the DID subject. Okay. So DID controller is the one who can create, update, or even revoke any type of such DID document about a DID subject. Okay. Giving an example, so it could be that IIT Kharagpur as DID controller, it sets up your DID, okay, of the students with all the details about when they join and the courses completed and so on and so forth. So that would go in the DID document, and then uh, of course the subject, the students themselves cannot create all those things, as you can well understand. So that is the difference between the DID controller and the DID subject. Okay, so here the student is the DID subject and the institute is the DID controller, and then the DID controller would put this create the DID document, and that will be recorded on a verifiable data registry. Okay, and then but then the subject knows the document that was created about him, and also has this particular DID which contains a DID URL, okay, which refers to this location where the document is present. Okay, so if the DID subject wants to present the DID to any service providing party, so DID will say that, hey, you see that this is the URI where you can get my information, and I am letting you use it. Okay, so then the service provider can actually use that URL, and I mean it would typically be called an URI, actually universal resource identifier, and then it would be able to get the document, okay, from the verifiable data registry, and then check for the identity. And of course there should be ways by which it it has to be guaranteed that uh, the the verifier would know that, first of all, as we said here, as these ones, that the verifying the identity issuer and verifying the identity holder. So the entire protocol should be such that it can verify indeed whether this controller had issued it, and indeed if it belongs to me as a subject who is presenting the identity and claiming to be having that particular identity. Okay, so that is how we have to ensure, and these are all given there in the in that website. And effectively, if you can see that there is a unique URI which identifies a subject, okay, the steps, and the DID subject is that entity, a person or organization, and so on being identified. And this DID controller is the entity with permission to change the DID document, and it could be the same as a subject for certain cases where the subject itself can self-certify. So that can also happen. And the DID document contains information. And now, as you can see, that it is written that public key of controller and all. So these two requirements, as you can very well understand, of verifying the identity issuer and verifying the identity holder, these steps in the digital domain, as we have already studied in so many different contexts in this course, is that this can be guaranteed through the use of the public key and private key. Okay. For example, that for the DID controller, whether indeed it was issued by the DID controller, that can be easily checked from the digital certificate, right? That sorry, digital. I mean, I take it back. So it's not digital certificate. So it is about if it must have been um, encrypted by the private key of the DID controller, so that if we can decrypt it using the controller's public key, we know that it was indeed uh, created or entered in the registry by that particular controller. Okay, and same is for the DID subject, that it should be possible that some information is encrypted by the DID subject, which can only be decrypted by the subject's public key, and because it can be decrypted by the subject's public key, it must have been encrypted by the subject. So it would definitely be able to also verify the both the identity holder as well as the identity issuer. Okay. So that is what we'll see how to ensure, okay, in this notion of DID. And so these are more details about the DID. So I think it is 11:55. So I'll stop here. So I have so far introduced this concept of DID. That is the last slide that we have here, how actually it works. But then a bit of more details about its implementation as to what is the format and how the URI looks like and the document, and finally how blockchains can really help in setting up this notion of decentralized identifiers. Okay, and as you can see slowly that these are all looking good till you consider that how we can ensure that this uh, data that is stored in the registry is not changed by the registry itself. Okay, or the DID controller changes it and the subject does not get to know about it, and so on. All these finally can be ensured through the use of a blockchain, where this will be not in a stored in a data registry in a silo somewhere where nobody has access to. Rather, this will be written. So this term verifiable is important, which was also mentioned here in red, that verifiable and decentralized. And these two immediately would bring the idea of blockchain in your mind, that it could be verifiable because it would be available for everybody to see, and also it would be decentralized. So we'll actually have this part, this data registry that would indeed be implemented by blockchain. Okay, so that is our final goal. That's where we are trying to arrive at. So in our next class, I will talk about this DID URI, how it looks like, the documents and the formats, so that we'll finally go into this notion of how to make use of blockchain for that. So I think I'll stop here for today. Is there any question?